Hey guys, welcome to a quick value betting guide that I put together. I've had a few people reach out to me with questions about value betting and how to think about creating a good value betting strategy. Um, so I figured I would put this material together. What we're going to be doing is taking a look at some of the theoretical concepts behind setting up a good framework for value betting, specifically on rivers. And then we're going to be taking a look at how these concepts apply to two real hands that I played online. And we're also going to be looking at the solver output for a couple of these hands as well, and sort of seeing how the solver thinks about this spot and what we can learn from that. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So the first thing we're going to take a look at are these two clips from two prominent poker YouTubers, cash game players, Mariano and Hungry Horse Poker. And what I want you to be paying attention to is what these two clips have in common. Less so in what actually happens at the table, but more about what the vlogger is saying about their thought process. So let's jump into it.
Like good news to me, and we go to a river, which is the eight of clubs. Dan checks again. Now it's back to me, and I wonder how much I would bet if I had a bluff. I don't think a huge size makes a whole lot of sense, so I put in around 2/3, 8,600. Dan does not seem to love it. He thinks it over for quite a bit, but don't blame him for eventually calling, as he did sort of slow play his ace most of the way, so folding on the river seems a little too tight. Unfortunately for Dan, I've got it this time, and we are off to a good.
All right, so that was Mariano value betting his trips on the river. And now let's take a look at clip number two.
Calls. River is now a king. He checks, and I think if I was trying to bluff an 8 on this river, probably have to go like 450, 475, something like that. I would love for an 8 to call here, so I go 300 into 370. He puts in a quick call, so I think I could have gotten maybe a little bit greedier, maybe 350 or 400 even, but
And that was Hungry Horse value betting his flush on the river. So do we notice anything in common between these two clips? And what I'm trying to get at here is that even your favorite prominent cash game players are making mistakes when it comes to value betting effectively, specifically in the thought process behind value betting. And of course, some players make more mistakes than others, but that's a topic for another day. So what these two clips sort of illustrated were what I consider to be pretty common misunderstandings of some fundamental theory in poker. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that outside factors should not influence our value betting strategy, in theory, of course. And what you'll have noticed is in these two clips, both players say things along the lines of, oh, if I was bluffing, I would want to do X. So I should consider doing X with my value hand, or I should consider doing something else with my value hand because of what I was doing with my bluff. Um, and I know that these two players really pride themselves on being good exploitative players, and of course, they're very successful players. Exploits are very good. But today, we're here to discuss a theoretical framework that once we understand well, we can deviate from and really punish people from like a solid theoretical backing and have exploits that are really rooted in some sound concepts. So again, having rationale behind taking an action with a value hand that goes like, I'm choosing a size that my bluffs would bet for balance, right? I think Mariano said something like, if I had a bluff here, I'd want to go maybe like, $8,000. So that's what I'm going to do with my value bet here. Or saying something like picking a size based on how likely it is to get called. I know in the second clip, Hungry Horse was like, if I was bluffing, I would go maybe $450, and I really want him to call, so I'm just gonna go 300 something dollars. And then you can even hear after the clip, he goes, maybe I could have been more greedy and gotten more. The truth is, these things they burn money in the long run. Maybe not in like individual from hand to hand. You could stumble into the right size with a wrong thought process, but this sort of thing will build up over a poker career and really hold you back and keep your win rate really capped when it could really grow a lot more. So today we're going to go over the correct framework for value betting so you can feel good about your value betting strategy and know that it's coming from a good place of good theoretical backing. So what we're going to talk about today is a four-step plan for value betting. It's really simple, and it's just a checklist you're going to want to go down when you arrive on a river, or even when you're just studying river spots to sort of get the muscle memory of this process, and then you can just kind of do it without even thinking. So step one, when we're thinking of how to value bet on the river, when you want to develop a value betting strategy, step one is, of course, to identify the value hands in your range. So what I mean by this is, what is every hand that we have in our range, or every hand class we have in our range, that could bet some size, any size, it can be as small as 1% pot or, as big as all in, that could theoretically be called by something worse. Is there a hand in villain's range that could call a bet of some size that is worse than the hand that we're betting? So let's identify all of these hands. Step two is to assign these value hands greedy bet sizes. And what I mean by this is basically picking the size, the maximum size that each of these hand classes can bet, such that they still get called by enough worse hands. Um, so obviously for stronger hands, this number is going to be higher. And for weaker hands, this number is going to be lower because we want worse hands in the villain's range to call this size. Step three is to determine a value threshold. And this means that we want to identify the weakest hand class that we would actually bet for value in the given spot. And this can be a function of how polar we are, if we're in position versus out of position, how simple or complex we want our strategy to be. But it's good to determine a value threshold. And then once we do that, we should eliminate all of the worse hands and sizes below that threshold and proceed using that threshold as the weakest hand we'd want to include in our betting strategy. And finally, step four is to prune extra sizes for simplification and execute our strategy. So to be balanced, we don't just want to bet every hand for that greedy size that maximizes how much it can get, because then of course we'd have like 10 or 15 different sizes for every different hand that we have, and that's impossible to balance, and our opponents would read into that really easily and of course punish us. So what we're going to do is group all of the remaining hands after we find our value threshold and into two sizes, preferably, maybe three sizes depending on the spot. And we can implement this strategy really easily as a human. Of course, computers can implement strategies using 4, 5, 6 sizes or more because they're computers and they can balance those things effectively. But we're not computers, so we want to isolate down to maybe 2, maybe 3 at most sizes in most spots so that we can actually implement that strategy. And of course, in this step, there are some extra edge case considerations as well that you want to consider when you're executing your strategy. Sometimes a hand that can bet for a very large size maybe wants to bet for a small size or check, depending on game considerations. But what we'll get out of the habit of doing is thinking that these hands want to bet for small sizes or check just because we want to be sneaky or just because we want to be trappy. You'll hear vloggers or content creators say that I'm just going to check this strong hand or block this strong hand just for deception or whatever it may be, right? And that's actually not a good reason to do something like that with a strong hand. Deciding to not bet big with a strong hand is a really big decision because good hands love betting big. So when you do so, you should really understand why you're doing that and make sure it makes sense. So this is our four-step plan. And let's think about what's actually missing from these four steps that we just talked about. Anything notable? Well, we didn't talk anything about bluffing, what our bluffing strategy looks like, or anything about trying to get called, right? Why is that? Well, bluffing, at the end of the day, it's a whole different topic. It's a really misunderstood concept that the bluffing portion of your strategy and the value betting portion of your strategy sort of operate in separate ways. The value hands in your strategy drive your betting and how you bet. They drive your betting strategy. Most value in poker, or basically all the value in poker, your win rate comes from making strong hands, betting them, and getting called by worse. So as a result, your value hands are going to be driving your betting strategies in poker. It is the onus of your bluffs. It's your bluff's responsibility to balance what your value wants to do, not vice versa. Because of that, this allows our value hands to bet as much as possible so that they can get called by worse. you should never be thinking, like Mariano was doing in that first clip, like, oh, if I was bluffing, I'd want to do X, so I'll do X with value, and then try and sort of balance your bluffs with your value hands. That's not a good framework for getting the most money in the long run. Um, the fact that our value bets are balanced by bluffs in that dynamic of the bluffs supporting the value, this forces our value bets to be effective. This is what allows us to bet as much as possible and be really greedy with our value hands because we know that they are supported by bluffs. So it doesn't matter if the opponent is reading into our strategy and, maybe they're overfolding because, our size is really big and we think, oh, we could have gotten paid if we just bet a little bit less or something, or chose to block instead of bet big. The truth is, we're going to be balanced, and our bluffs are going to be using those sizes as well. So we're going to be punishing them in that part of the game tree when they're overfolding to our big sizes. Um, it is a common misconception that we want to give them an easy call when we bet. We don't want to just bet so they can just snap us off and pay us our little bit of money. We want to push them to be as indifferent as possible. And what I mean by that is we want to make them have a zero EV decision or as close to a zero EV decision as possible with as much of their range as possible. We don't want them to have a clear decision. If they're snapping us off with some portion of their range and we're getting paid in a given spot, that means that we gave a lot of their calling range an easy decision to call very quickly, as opposed to actually making them pay the correct price with the hands that should call our value. And at the end of the day, the other half of this dynamic is, of course, the bluffing, which supports our value betting. And bluffing is hard. Basically, what you have to do when you're implementing a bluffing strategy, or trying to figure out how to bluff on a given river or something like that, is to do all of those value betting steps that we just talked about. And then, once you know what your value betting strategy looks like, we have to allocate the correct bluffing combos into the correct sizes in order to balance every size. That's part of our betting strategy. And we'll probably discuss this in further educational material because it's a whole new topic and it's a lot of material. And I think it's really good to understand the value betting concepts first before moving to the bluffing concepts. All right, so let's jump into some examples. Hey guys, this is our first example hand we're going to go over. It is a button versus big blind single raise pot spot, or an example of being in position and trying to come up with a good value betting strategy. So yeah, let's jump into it. This hand gets started at 100 NL on PokerStars Pennsylvania. I believe everyone at this table is actually a reg. I'm reg battling for some reason here. Don't really remember what was going on. This hand happened a little while ago. Yeah, so let's just jump into it. We open ace jack off on the button to 2.5 big blinds and get a call from the big blind. Flop is jack 10 3 two-tone, and you could play some like bigger sizes on these flops with double Broadway, disconnected, like even overbet or pot or 75% or something like that. But I think I was playing like 4 or 5 tables at the time. And when that's the case, I usually tend to keep things as simple as possible and just bet range for a small size, which is what I decide to do here, 1/3, and we get called. The turn is the ace, giving us 2 pair. And on a turn like this, I am going to be playing big bet or check. You could use like small overbet, you could use pot, you could use 75%. I prefer like overbetting a little bit less when a straight comes in. So I think this time I decide to go with 75% or check. And of course, this hand makes like a pretty good betting candidate. Obviously, it's top 2 pairs, very strong hand. And we get the call from the big blind. And then the river is the deuce of hearts, which is a fairly bricky river. 4-5 will come in sometimes. Maybe like ace deuce comes in, sometimes, which is of course a hand we're beating anyway. But so fairly brickish river. So yeah, and then now it's on us to come up with a good value betting strategy, and figure out how to value bet our strong hands in this spot. So let's jump into this process. So we're going to go through those 4 steps that we identified already of being the good steps for creating a value betting framework. And step 1 is, of course, to identify all of our value hands that we could have on this river. So when we arrive here, we could have the following value hands. We could have low pairs. So this is the deuce X and 3X region, like king deuce and queen deuce suited, as well as king 3, queen 3 suited. Um, some pocket pairs, maybe like the rare 4s or 5s that decides to bet turn, the rare 10X that decides to bet turn as well, but this is mostly just going to be deuce X and 3X. We have medium pairs, which is stuff like Jack X that decides to bet the turn, but again, that's pretty infrequent. But we could definitely have pocket kings, for example, that bets turn. We have top pairs, so hands like Ace King and Ace Queen, Ace 9 down to Ace 4, some of the weaker ones that decide to bet the turn as well. And of course, we have two pairs, like the hand we have here. That's Ace Jack suited and offsuit, Ace 10 suited and offsuit, Jack 10 suited and offsuit, and Ace 3 and Ace Deuce suited. And of course, we have our sets. So we have basically every set here, I think. Aces, Jacks, 10s, 3s, and deuces. And then, of course, we have the nuts, the straights. King, queen, off, and suited. So step 2, once we've identified all of those value hands that we can have, we want to assign greedy sizes to all of these different hand classes. So what are the sizes that are, as big as possible that could still theoretically be called by worse? So let's take a look at our value hands. So our low pairs, we could probably bet something like maybe 5 or 10% pot. They can barely get called by anything worse for any larger. They'd have to start getting called by like high card hands. So getting really, really thin, and they're pretty weak. So, maybe something really small like 5% pot, 10% pot, something like that. Our medium pairs, they could consider potentially like a block sizing. Block sizes with hands like, say, pocket kings could get called by worse one pair hands, so that's something to consider. So I think that size would be the greedy size for that hand class. For top pairs, sort of depending on the kicker, I think we could pick a greedy size for a top pair of anything between like 50% to 75% pot. Ideally would be targeting worse pairs, maybe high card bluff catches sometimes, but yeah, probably just worse pairs. So I think like a hand like Ace King, Ace Queen could probably use something on the upper end of this range, like 75% pot, but some of the worse Ace X probably could consider something like, maybe a half pot size bet to still target sufficient worse pair hands. Our two pairs, so hands like Ace Jack, obviously, like the one we have, probably can go anywhere from like 100% pot to maybe 150% pot, depending on the strength and the blockers. What we're going to be doing with two pairs is targeting top pairs, so targeting Ace X, and of course some bluff catchers. So, hands with maybe just like a jack, like King Jack, Queen Jack, those types of hands. And probably worse two pairs as well. So if we have a hand like Ace Jack or Ace 10, these two pairs dominate other two pairs. So those are also hands that we're going to be targeting, which is what lets us bet, over the pot, like 150% pot. If we go a little bit bigger than that, though, we're starting to isolate the villain's range down to like the strongest two pair, like Ace Jack, sets and straights, obviously. So that's why I think two pair falls into this like 100 to 150% pot category. Sets, we can obviously bet really large with our sets. There's like some slight difference in which sets can bet which sizes. I think like 250% pot to 300% pot is probably roughly accurate. We're basically targeting two pair. We're targeting the best top pair bluff catches. This is a nearly all-in size, so almost any other hand that calls is going to be worse. Obviously, we can even target some worse sets with our best sets as well here. But you'll notice that this isn't necessarily just all in, just simplifying to all in, because, when we do just shove for, 4x pot here, a majority of the time the hands that we're going to get called by are going to be, maybe some trapped sets that potentially are better than whatever set we're value betting, and of course straights. So that's why I put it on the upper end of like 250 to 300% pot. Obviously going all in with a set would not be a mistake, as we'll see actually later. And then, of course, our straights, these are the nuts, so king, queen off and king, queen suited, they can just go all in for 400% pot. They are the nuts. By definition, anything that calls is worse, so therefore, we could go all in as the greedy size. Again, we aren't really thinking about, like, what makes sense realistically when we're doing this process. However, we will see that, you know, king queen can do some interesting things here in this spot. But what we're thinking about is, theoretically speaking, are there hands worse that can call, um, given our size? And if we go all in, definitionally, anything that calls the nuts is going to be worse. So that's why the nuts can go all in. So, okay, now we've decided the greedy sizes for all of these hand classes. Step 3 is going to be determining the value threshold. So obviously we don't want to bet all of those hand classes. So we have low pairs, medium pairs, top pairs, two pairs, sets, and straights. This is a lot of our range. I don't think we're going to want to be betting all of these hands, especially in position when we have the opportunity of reopening the action for the out of position player. So let's try and determine a value threshold. So I think for the low pairs, we aren't going to want to bet these like deuce X and 3X because there's just not enough hands in villain's range worth targeting. It's super, super thin, especially when we have a hand like king deuce and king 3. Like we have a king, which sort of blocks like those king X hero calls we'd want to get called by anyway. So I really don't think that having 10% or like a really small size for these hands in our strategy is going to be something that we're doing. Additionally, I think we can get rid of the medium pairs as well that can use like that 33% size. And this comes down to we don't really want to block bet in position. Basically, blocking in position is very rarely a thing because a hand that is only good enough to bet a small size in position on the river, actually usually has better EV just checking back and trying to realize their showdown value. So that's the case here as well. So this like Jack X and even pocket kings, they probably don't want to be doing any betting in position. So I'm going to get rid of that category as well. And top pair, you could go either way with including top pair in our value, past our value threshold. I think it probably depends on the strength of the top pair, but for now, I'm just going to say that we're basically too polar when we decide to go bet, bet, and then bet again in position on the river. And we don't really need to include top pair in like a really ultra polar betting strategy for the river. You can if you want to make your strategy a little bit more complex. But I think for simplicity, I think I'm just going to focus on two pair and better. Of course, you might be thinking, like, how are you not going to be betting ace king on this river? Well, it turns out we're actually going to have a lot of value hands. And because of how polar we are, we can squeeze a lot, of those really strong value hands into our betting strategy here. And then just take our showdown with a lot of hands as well. So we've determined that in this example, our value threshold is going to be these two pairs. So anything below two pair, we probably won't bet. And two pair plus can obviously bet. So step 4 is to prune sizes and execute, of course. So basically, again, we don't want to just be taking the exact size that every hand class wants because, again, that's too predictable. It's not balanced. People can read into that pretty easily. Which is why we want to condense these sizes down to a strategy that makes sense of only 2 or maybe 3 sizes. So you can see I included top pair here just because you could consider betting like ace king, ace queen here. But you can see how a strategy that uses like 75%, 100 to 150, 250 to 300, and 400 for all of our different hand classes gets reduced to just like 2 or 3 sizes here, with going 75 for top pair, 150% pot with two pair, and then sets and straights just being lumped together and going all in. You can make an argument that when sets go all in, it's like getting a little thin, but I still think it's totally fine, and I think the solver would agree with me. And you're probably thinking like, hang on, like you can just go all in for 4x pot, and the answer is yes. When you go bet, 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 and you never get raised by your opponent, you are becoming increasingly polar, and they're becoming increasingly merged. And when this is the case, this often results in you being uncapped and having all of the nuts and all the nutted strongest hands, and your opponent having a range that is mostly bluff catchers. So hands like one pair, maybe like two pair at best. And when this dynamic is the case, this asymmetry, it allows us to put maximum pressure on villain's range and just use really, really large bet sizes to try and just play for all of the chips with our best hands. That's why you're going to see hands like sets and straights just going all in here for 4x the size of the pot. So this is really good to know about when you are value betting that you're allowed to use all in certain scenarios, or else you're going to be sacrificing a lot of EV. And of course, that all in size is going to be balanced with bluffs as well, which is why, we force our opponent to call sometimes, basically, with worse hands. So you can see I also just decided to cross out the top pair, segment of our strategy here, just for simplicity's sake. I think we can keep it isolated down to just betting 2 pair plus. So now our strategy only has 2 sizes, which is, really easy to execute. So that would be our strategy. So we're going to be going 150% pot with 2 pairs, and basically all in with sets and straights. So if I go back to the hand in the moment, I did decide to go for 150% pot. We get the tank from villain, and he puts in the call. And he has the bluff catch, the ace-5 suited with the ace blocker. So I think that's a totally reasonable call. So yeah, pretty normal hand. And you can see that we took what might have looked like an unintuitive very large sizing for 2 pair, like 150% pot, or maybe this is intuitive for you. But this size definitely goes along with maximizing our value for 2 pair. So yeah, really glad that this hand worked out. And you can see that this is our final strategy here that we're going to use. So that good to know. All right, guys, just wanted to jump into the solver review for example number 1 here. So you can see we are at the river node of this hand, where on the river deuce of hearts, the big blind checks, and it's on us. So if you recall, we decided that our strategy was going to be 150% pot, or just like a big bet for our 2 pair. And then for our sets and our straights, we were just going to be shoving 4x pot all in. And so let's take a look at what the solver's doing. So the first thing that we should notice is that we should probably notice the shape of the sort of betting buckets distribution here. And what you'll notice is that it's very polar. Whenever we have this sort of curve shape with the betting frequencies here, of being either very strong, 2 pair plus, or obviously our total bluffs, that's very polar. And when this is the case, the more polar we are, because we're betting stricter and stricter hands for value, we get to bet bigger and bigger and press our nut advantage. So you will totally see that the solver loves to use all in. Just 4x pot, shove it in there. You can see that the main value hands it uses are the sets and straights. So aces, jacks, tens, threes, and deuces. And of course, the king, queen. And I actually forgot that 5-4, that we could also have some 5-4. So there you go. So the solver totally loves going 4x pot, shove, all in with those strongest hands. So I think we basically nailed that right on the head. The other contingent, or the other, I guess, part of the betting strategy that we decided on was to use a big size with our 2 pair hand. So let's check out 2 pair, and you'll notice 2 pair, this little line right here, is being included in the bet with the straight and sets. But worse than 2 pair is not. This is obviously this sort of is mirroring what we determined to be our value threshold. So that's good to know that the solver is picking a similar value threshold. Now, if we look at the exact size that the solver is using, I think this pink corresponds to this like almost pot size bet for 2 pair. Which is fine. I think we decided that we would want to be around pot or maybe a little over pot. You can see it's also using some of the 150% pot for 2 pair as well, especially ace jack, because it's like the best 2 pair. So I think it's totally fine that we decided to just be playing 150% pot and 400% pot as our strategy. So yeah, that's really good to see that we made a good decision here. You can see that some of the best top pairs are taking some like weird like 2/3 sizes. Or I guess even a 1/3 size, like an in-position block. But again, I don't recommend playing in-position blocks. And I wouldn't be using 60% pot just because I don't really want to use 3 sizes in position. It doesn't seem like a good idea. So yeah, I think just using like a big size, like one of these, and then all in for our nuts is a really good strategy. So yeah, good to see that the solver agrees with our breakdown now. All right, let's jump into example number 2. All right, here is example number 2. This is a heads up hand actually. We are big blind versus the button. And this is an example of out of position value betting strategy. So let's get into the hand here. We have ace queen off. Button opens to 3 big blinds, which is a little big for heads up, but still fine. We decide to 3-bet with ace queen off, which is standard, and button puts in the call. The flop comes queen queen 9 two-tone, and we decide to c-bet like 20% pot roughly, and this is probably just what I'm doing with range here, just betting like 20% pot, just for simplicity on these paired Broadway boards. You can just bet small with range, so that's what I decided to do. We do get to call. Turn is the ace of hearts, so we obviously turn a full house here. On the turn, I think you can just be playing like big bet, like a geometric size, something I guess it's like 2/3 maybe, or check. And I decide to actually put this hand into the checking category because it basically blocks the entire board. So we want to allow the opponent either to catch up or to bluff, or maybe we take our street of value on the river when they're more likely to bluff catch, just because we block, you know, basically every decent hand that they could have here. They decide to check back, and the river is the 4 of spades. So now we should decide what to do, what our value betting strategy looks like here with ace queen and obviously with our whole strategy. So let's go through the steps. So step 1 is to identify all the value hands in our range, as we know. So what value hands do we have? Well, we have low pairs, a bunch of them. We have 7s, 8s. Since we did check the turn after c-betting small on the flop, we just have a bunch of hands that are, kind of weak low pairs here. 7s, 8s, some 9x, some offsuit 9s as well. So we have a lot of these low pairs, 9x and 8s and 7s. We have medium pairs, so these are hands like 10s, jacks, and kings, which obviously check the turn on the overcard that comes out. We have top pairs, so we're going to turn some ace-x that can just mix in some checks as well. So we have hands like ace-king and obviously ace-jack all the way down to ace-deuce. We have trips, so we have a bunch of queen-x, so that's like king-queen, queen-jack, queen-10. Some of these queen-x suited that 3-bets. And then, of course, we have flushes as well. So we have nut flushes like ace-x spades. We have king-x of spades, jack-x of spades. A lot of these suited Broadway type, or, suited ace-x, king-x, and jack-x hands that 3-bet pre-flop. And then, of course, we have like the nuts, the full houses. We have aces, ace-queen, queen-9, pocket nines. These are all full houses. I left out queens here just because, quads. Just because I think quads can basically always bet on the turn because we unblock the ace-x that we are trying to get value from. So I think I'd basically always bet queens on the turn. So for simplicity, I'm just going to say that the best hands we have on this river are full houses. All right, so now we'll do step 2. Assign the value hands greedy sizes. So again, low pairs, maybe only 10% pot. Very few worse hands are going to be able to call any other size. Medium pairs, so like 10s, jacks, and kings, they could block for that 33% pot size and theoretically be called by worse 1 pairs or maybe even a high card hand. We have top pairs, and depending on the strength, I think they could go anywhere from like only maybe a small bet to maybe they can get away with a bigger bet for the stronger ones. And is basically at the end of the day for our top pair hands, there's sort of a limited value region for top pair when we take a large size. Really, we'd just be targeting other top pairs, and other than that, they're not going to have hands like kings or jacks or tens because those probably mostly 4-bet pre. We obviously lose the queen x and flushes, so it starts to get a little thin with top pair for bigger sizes. So that's why I kind of rooted it in like the 33% size for top pair. We have trips, which can probably go like a round pot. They're strictly targeting ace-x basically, and I guess some other bluff catchers. Any larger than like a pot or a little over pot probably starts to get too thin now that the flush came in. And of course we have those flushes, so with the flush we can probably go anywhere from like 150% pot, 200% pot, depending on how strong our flush is. We're going, and also some blocking effects as well. So we're going to be targeting trips, ace-x, top pairs, weaker flushes even. So that's what we can get away with targeting for those sizes with flushes. And then of course some full houses. Full houses are basically, all of them are basically good enough to go all in, because they are the effective nuts. In position is capped. They could theoretically have flopped queen nine, but nines, they could consider raising on the flop. They could consider raising pre, um, and aces obviously they can't have. Ace queen they could probably have, but for the most part, our full houses are the effective nuts. So basically anything that calls is worse. Um, so again, we want to determine a value threshold. So let's get rid of the low pairs because I just don't think there aren't, again, there aren't enough worse hands in villain's range that we can target with like a tiny size with these really, really weak hands. So, but then I think we can actually just draw the value threshold at the medium pairs. And you might be thinking, how could we do it this time, but not in the last example? Well, when we're out of position, our value betting strategy can actually be a lot less polar. And we're allowed to use block sizes, like small sizes, to try and get value from, or get value with our like medium strength hands. And this also sort of discourages, being attacked as well when we use like our block sizes, because of course our block is going to be balanced as well with some stronger hands, as we'll see. But basically, the consideration is when we're out of position, we regardless are going to be letting in position dictate if they want to put any more money in, right? If they want to keep the action open. When we are in position and we get checked to, when we bet small, we are giving out of position a strategic opportunity to then, we're reopening the action for them to then do something like going all in, or, to potentially put our hands that would want to bet small in a bad spot. Here, we're going to be in a bad spot regardless if we check a weak hand and face a bet, so we can actually block to target a portion of villain's range as opposed to checking with some of our medium strength hands. So that's why blocking is allowed out of position. So as a result, we've determined that the value threshold is going to be these medium pairs, like kings, jacks, and tens. And we could probably use like a small 1/3 pot size bet for these hands. All right, so step 4, let's prune all of those hands that we identified as being as part of our value betting strategy into a more manageable sizing strategy. So here we have all of those hands. And this is like a simple way to break down the sizes. So we have medium pairs and top pairs going for 1/3 for the block, because I decided to lump in top pair into the small bet category for reasons we discussed earlier. We also have trips, flushes, and full houses going just for like an overbet. I wanted to lump these three hands together, just because I think using three sizes is perhaps a little bit too complicated for this spot. I think just having small bet and big bet is good. And I think the best big bet size that sort of allows us to big bet all of these hands is like just a 125% pot over bets. I think the nut advantage here is less pronounced. We're also less polar in this spot than we were in the last spot. So I do think that like that massive overbet all in, like we saw the 4x overbet all in last time being a thing. I don't know if the 3x overbet all in is going to be a thing in this spot, just because the nut advantage is kind of similar. They do have some of those full houses like I mentioned before, and we're less polar. We do want to be betting more hand classes out of position. So yeah, I think we're just going to be using just like a normal overbet size as our big size. But wait, we can't just only be betting our value hands here, because when we check, we'll have absolutely nothing to defend our range with. So, and as also, we can't just be putting our your weaker value hands into the small size, because again, when we just bet a small size, we're never going to have a hand better than top pair, so they can easily hero call us with something like a good top pair or bluff us. So we're going to introduce the extra balance into our out of position value betting strategy here. So we're going to be using the 33% pot size bet for some flushes and some full houses as well. The reason being, we can probably use the small bet size for ace x of spades because the ace actually blocks calls. So we can use like ace x of spades as a blocks to remain balanced with our small size. We can also use some full houses or many full houses in the block size as well, because full houses like ace queen, queen nine, pocket aces, these hands block so much of the board that you can get away with you don't want to be using just like all in or like a really big size, because we sort of narrow down the number of combos that we can actually get value from. So as a result, we're going to be shifting it out of like the highest, like the largest, most greedy bet size into a smaller one that still accomplishes generating a lot of EV based on the blocking effects. So you can see that here we have like flushes still mostly going for a big size, but some of them are going to be using small sizes now too, specifically ace-x flushes that block the ace. And then a lot of full houses are going to be using the small size as well. And it's good to understand blocking effects so you know which full houses and which flushes, to be splitting into these different sizes. But it's really important that you do have some balance in your small sizes, or else you're just going to get punished by people who assume you're not balancing correctly. Additionally, we want to include a checking component, basically across all hand classes, and you're going to be designating this based on like the relative strength within a category, so like the worst of a top pair versus the best of a top pair, checking versus betting. You're also going to be designating this based on blockers and unblocker effects as well, which are probably a topic for another day, but this is how you're going to be using checking in the strategy as well, because again, we are going to want to check and show down sometimes, and when we check, we can't just have those weak showdown hands. We do also want to have some traps. And the traps we select, we don't pick just to be trappy, just to be sneaky. We want to pick specific combos that have those good blocking and unblocking effects that actually generate EV when we check. So yeah, this is our final strategy here. It looks kind of complicated, but it's really not that bad. We're just going to be betting small with medium pairs and top pairs. We're going to be betting big with trips, flushes, and full houses, and of course mixing in some smaller bet sizes, some blocks with our flushes and full houses as well, and then throwing in some checks basically with every hand class based on blockers, unblockers, and relative hand strength. So what did I decide to do in this spot? I think what I decided was to probably play something like three sizes in the moment. I thought this player was like perhaps a bit weaker based on like his opening size was 3 big blinds, and some of the other things he was doing were a bit sketchy. So I think I decided to play three sizes, and when you go three sizes here, I think you can play block, uh, you know, medium normal size bet, and really big bet. So I maybe was playing something like 33%, 66%, and like 100 and 25% or something like that. And I actually decided to put ace queen not into the biggest size for the reasons that we discussed, because I think we want to be using full houses in some of the smaller sizes based on how much of the board that we actually do just destroy and block. And then we do get a call, and villain had a flush, so we get value from the 8 high flush here. Very interesting hand for sure. Yeah. Hey guys, this is the solver analysis for example number 2, the heads up spot. So you can see that we are in a heads up sim here with the flop queen queen 9 two-tone, turn ace, river 4, and the node is here in the big blind, on river, out of position. And I think the first thing that's good to notice is that the betting strategy in this example, as opposed to the last one, is a lot less polar. You can see it's very flat. There isn't much of the curved sort of distribution look in this example, which makes sense considering the action, some of the things that we've discussed already. As a result, you'll see that we are using the small size very, very often. As we predicted, the block was going to be a component of our strategy here, as opposed to the previous example. So if we take a look at the value threshold that it looks like the solver is setting, it looks like the solver is basically setting something here, maybe, something like this. So under pair and third pair, well, let's click on those and see what those are. We can see that looks like kings, jacks, and tens, like we identified, are going to be the value threshold. What size do they want to bet? Well, they want to bet the block size, so I think we did a good job identifying that. The other component is obviously the bigger bet size, or the stronger hands. So the solver is using basically, I think, 100% pot as its bigger size. So if we go to the hands where it's using that, you can see that it is mostly going to be trips and better. So trips, flushes, and full houses. Um, and you can see that as we decided, trips were going to be going into this large bet size, basically pure, or not pure, but like, definitely majority going into this bigger bet size. Um, but as we discussed, you'll actually notice that flushes and full houses are being used in the small bet size as well. And if we zoom in a little bit on where exactly this is happening, you can see that flushes with the ace of spades are using the small bet more often, and then flushes like, king jack and king 10. Those ones are taking some bigger sizes. In fact, those ones are even going all in. But the smallest sizes here are being used for the nut flushes, which is a little less intuitive, but it's because of the blocker and unblocker effects. And again, I don't think we, in practice, should probably be using three sizes here. You can totally just pick all in as your big size and then just use like a small size and all in, but I think that probably misses out on a little bit of EV compared to having a small size and a big size. So yeah, that's what flushes are doing. Now let's go check out full houses, and you can see with our exact hand, ace queen off, it does get used a lot in the small size of the block. And that makes sense because we just have the entire board locked up. We don't interfere with any of like the trash. We also don't interfere with any of the checkbacks. So it's important that we do actually bet this hand as opposed to checking it. Because when we do bet, or sorry, if we were to check, then a big component of the range that's going to check back are going to be hands like king X and stuff like that. And we don't have a king. We totally unblock all that stuff. So it's really important that we decide to block this hand class. But you see that some full houses are getting used as checks, and specifically ones that like block the entire flop. So like queen 9 and some other hands that have interesting unblocker and blocker effects, which we can get into, in further material. And you can see that there's also a checking component across basically every hand class. As I mentioned, it's good to have checks scattered across all of these hand classes so that our check is balanced. And we're not just going to be checking randomly. Obviously, you want to be checking hands that have good properties for checking. Um, you know, like some of those ace-x flushes have good properties for checking. Some of those full houses that completely block the board or unblock hands that we want him to have. These ones make for good checks as well. Again, when we check a strong hand, we want to do so with hands that are going to face bets more often. So that's what these hand classes are going to have. These ones, or these combos are going to have, as opposed to these combos. These combos want to bet for those reasons, and these combos want to check and try and face a bet. So yeah, those concepts are a little more tricky, but generally it's good to see that the solver is roughly doing the strategy that we outlined. So yeah. All right, just some final concepts to go over. Important things to know when we are thinking about our value betting framework. Without going into too much detail here, you saw how some of the effects of blockers and unblockers really informed our out of position value betting strategy. These are some pretty complicated factors usually, and they do ultimately go into deciding what we do with certain value hands in out of position value betting spots. So utilizing blocks and checks instead of just the greedy size that we determine. And we can probably touch on these topics at a later date. I'd also recommend in the moment, once you have a good understanding of the way this framework works, obviously you can use exploits to determine these things as well. If you think your opponent is too stabby in position, or you think they're too passive or too aggressive, whatever it may be, can inform how you designate different hands into these balancing categories, basically. And yeah, exactly. Exploits are good. So once you have a really good understanding of this theoretical framework that we went over today, you can sort of implement this process in your head. Then you can study how to deviate from that framework to punish imbalanced opponents. And exploits that are rooted in theory are always going to perform way, way better than exploits that are just, based on your feel or whatever you're trying to gauge from the game without really understanding what the theoretical strategies look like. Exploits that are based in good theory, with knowledge of what, some of the true game theory principles, those are always going to be much, much better. And another important thing to know is that the framework we learned here today about how to value bet river also sort of applies to value betting the turn or just betting turn in general. Um, the flop is mostly mechanical, as we sort of have discussed flop strategies in the past, as like how there's a lot of memorization and some like a lot of heuristics and things like that. But on the turns, many of the concepts we learned here today definitely apply. So those steps are going to look like identify value hands and sizes, so hands that want to bet, pick a value threshold, and then basically build a strategy around that threshold. What's the weakest hand we want to bet for value? And then pick a size based on that hand. And ideally, we just want to use one bet size and go from there. However, things are a little bit different because there's other factors in play, like equity considerations, because obviously there's still a card to come. But some things are very similar about the turn betting strategy. And yeah, that basically sums everything up. Thank you for watching. I'm happy to answer any questions about any of this material. So yeah, feel free to reach out, and I'll see you guys next time.